Now let's talk a little bit about the Dark Side of the Ring documentaries from Viceland. They premiered this week. It's part of a series of I think there's about half a dozen of them. The first two are online. They are free to view. You can watch them right now. The Killing of Bruiser Brody, which is up on their YouTube channel, and The Match Made in Heaven, which is about the Macho Man Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth. That is up. You can watch that on the Viceland website. I don't know if that one's on YouTube or not. So you can watch them right now. The Brody documentary is narrated by Mick Foley. And they have interviews with Tony Atlas, Dutch Mantell, and Abdullah the Butcher. All three of whom were there in Puerto Rico at the, I guess it was a WWC show, the night that Brody was stabbed in Puerto Rico back in 1988. They also have interviews with Brody's wife, Barbara, who, from what I understand, I know she wrote a book, apparently a very good book, about Bruiser Brody that came out a number of years ago, and Brody's son, Jeff, who was a little kid. He was just a little boy when his father was murdered. And in fact, when Tony Atlas is talking about the day of the murder when it happened, the entire time he claims that Brody was clutching a small photo of his son in his hand as he was laying there dying on the floor. And clearly his son still harbors a lot of anger over what happened, as well he should. And he flat out says it in the documentary. They never got justice. And I've heard this story before. I've talked about at length the Bruiser Brody story, the Bruiser Brody injustice. I did a whole segment on it once here on the podcast, and it got me angry all over again. Listening to these guys talk about what happened that day backstage at the show in Puerto Rico. Tony Atlas was there for the entire thing. He wasn't in the shower stall when Brody was stabbed. He got called into the shower stall by Jose Gonzalez, who played the role of, I think, Invader number 1. And was, he was a star at the time in Puerto Rico and would go on to remain a star for many years. And it goes into details about the different issues that he and Brody had. And, Brody owed him money, and he wasn't happy that Brody was gaining power and trying to buy into, potentially buy shares of the company, and that he might try to sort of edge out Gonzalez. And Gonzalez had a little son of his own who I think had been electrocuted and died not too long before all this happened. All these things that you've probably heard if you've read about this story before. But the really chilling stuff, obviously, is the retelling of what happened that day. Dutch Mantell was there. He can feel that there was just a very uneasy feeling of tension in the air to where he just left to go walk around. He just couldn't sit in the locker room anymore. He got up, he left Brody, and just was kind of walking around. So when the actual stabbing took place, he wasn't there. He kind of came in the aftermath of it all. Same thing with Abdullah the Butcher. He was there, but had to be told what happened. He couldn't believe it. But Tony Atlas was there. That's the one consistency that's always been part of his story and the overall story in all these years since the incident happened. Tony Atlas was there. He was in the locker room. He saw Brody stumble out of the shower, bleeding to death. And he did what he could to try to help him. Got him down on the ground, trying to put pressure on the wound, shouting, calling for them to get an ambulance. Took 45 minutes for an ambulance to get to that building, to transport Brody to the hospital where ultimately he died on the operating room table. But to listen to Atlas tell the story in great detail about Invader coming out of the shower, having this giant knife in his hand, and then Carlos Colon, the booker, getting into a shouting match with him. Gonzalez leaves, packs his bag and leaves. Comes back later. New change of clothes. He had blood all over his shirt. Now he comes back, change of clothes. Murder weapon is gone. People in the locker room are laughing. This is when he gets back to the dressing room later after helping, get Brody to the hospital. People are in the locker room laughing. Carlos Colon is sitting there. They're all talking like nothing ever happened. It's as though nothing ever happened. And when Carlos Colon was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, that was the last Hall of Fame I probably went to. I haven't been to any of the ceremonies since because it just got so freaking boring. But I'm at the Hall of Fame the year he's inducted. I got up, I went to go take a piss. That's what I think of Carlos Colon being in the WWE Hall of Fame. Do I think that he helped cover things up and is complicit in what happened? You bet your ass I do. And I wasn't there, right? None of us were there. Tony Atlas was there. But you hear the stories about what happened and the way that in shoot interviews he answers questions or then says, I don't really want to answer questions. Yeah, of course you don't. Of course he was a contributor in covering up what happened. What happened there was a fucking injustice. One of the most disgusting things in wrestling history is what happened to Bruiser Brody. So they arrest this guy. And the only reason they arrested Gonzalez was because Tony Atlas was the one witness they had who was willing to come forward and say, I saw what happened. Because the word had spread around the locker room that Gonzalez had stabbed him in self-defense. They saw Brody as this wild man. They figured, well, that must be the way he is in real life. All Gonzalez was trying to do was just protect himself, self-defense. Tony Atlas was the only guy who said that's bullshit. That is a crock of shit. Let me tell you what happened. He became the lone witness. So they arrested Gonzalez, and they said, we're going to call you back to fly back here to Puerto Rico to testify. And then later on, Tony Atlas comes to find out the trial was done, and Gonzalez was acquitted. He never got a subpoena to testify. Or if he did, I think he said it came in the mail weeks later. By the time he got it, the trial was already over. The fix was in. From day one. And what's even more maddening about this whole thing is that it's not as though Gonzalez became some kind of pariah in the wrestling industry. He came back and he continued to be a big star and to book and promote and do all of these different things to this very day. The man was never brought to justice. And you hear stories about how difficult Bruiser Brody was to deal with. He was a nightmare for promoters. It doesn't matter. That has nothing to do with the fact that the guy was stabbed to death, laying there on the floor bleeding out. Nobody deserves that. And the fact that this guy continues to just walk around free and is still part of the wrestling business and hasn't been shunned or blackballed or anything like that. There have been other people who've been blackballed for wrestling for a lot less than what this guy did to Bruiser Brody. It is a fucking injustice. And just listening to the story all over again just made me so mad. So it's a dark story. Don't get me wrong. But if you are not familiar with who Bruiser Brody was, if you're not familiar with the story, it's probably as compelling a documentary as you're going to get out of all 6 or so of them that they've done. It is very well put together. It is very well done. And I also have to say this about Abdullah the Butcher. You know, he says some things in there about, there was a discussion about there being a meeting back at the hotel or something about what had happened, which he denies. And Tony Atlas says, oh, is that what he says? Well, he's lying. Abdullah the Butcher doesn't exactly come across as a Class A type guy either in this documentary. There's a lot of bad people involved here. Tony Atlas is not one of them. Tony Atlas is very compelling. And all the other shoot interviews and things, when he's talked about this, he's always been very consistent. For the most part, with all of the details and everything, he's been very consistent with what happened. So I would say it's absolutely worth watching. It's not a happy story. It doesn't have a happy ending. But it's absolutely worth checking out. Now, the other Vice documentary I had a chance to watch was the first one that aired on TV the other night, which was Match Made in Heaven, which was about Macho Man and Miss Elizabeth. This one was narrated by Dutch Mantell. So Mantell is interviewed as kind of an eyewitness in the first documentary, but he narrates this one. And he was familiar with Savage going back to the days of the ICW promotion, which was run by Savage's father and the Poffo family. So anyway, he is the narrator for this second documentary here. I was not as much a fan of this. And I'm a big Macho Man Elizabeth fan, and it was really cool to see a lot of the old footage of the Mega Powers and the Mega Powers splitting and the snake bite incident with Jake Roberts. They get into all of that stuff. All it is really is just a retelling of Savage's career and Elizabeth's involvement in his career. And it's nothing, if you are a wrestling fan, it is nothing that you already did not know. I learned nothing new watching this documentary that I hadn't already heard. So it was disappointing to me in that way. One of the people they interviewed was Linda Bolea, the ex-wife of Hulk Hogan. because she and Hulk would hang out a lot with Randy and Liz. Liz would come down and hang out with her a lot. And it also led to a lot of problems between Hulk and Randy, because when Elizabeth basically decided to leave Randy and would go down to Florida to hang out with Hulk's wife, Savage was looking for her, didn't know where she was, because they get into the whole thing about Savage being very controlling. Again, we've heard all this before. But he kind of blamed Linda and Hulk, and that was really the start of a lot of the real-life angst between Savage and Hogan. The first time, I mean, they made up, and then they were enemies again, and then they made up, and Hogan claims before Macho Man died, he saw him at the doctor's office, and they made up. It's Hulk Hogan, so who the fuck knows? So they do get into that, and Linda has some Actually, the one thing I will say, in showing some old photos that she has at home in her albums, Linda showed a photo of Vince McMahon without a shirt on. I guess hanging out maybe at the pool at their home or whatever from like 1989 or something. And Vince was jacked even then. You know, God knows what he was doing. Probably like Hogan and the rest of them. But if you think that Vince only got jacked kind of in the late 90s, like later in life, when he got to like the Attitude Era and all that, guy was jacked. Guy was in good shape, I will say. I had never seen that photo before. But again, disappointing in that I didn't learn anything I didn't already know. So when it was over, it was like, oh, okay, I already knew this. And of course, they got into the death of Elizabeth with Lex Luger and, you know, the 911 call. And they talked about Savage finding love late in his life. They didn't even get into the idea that they had known each other from years earlier. He had found like an old high school sweetheart of his. They had reunited later in life and gotten married. And then they talked about the car accident. They had Lanny Poffo, he's interviewed, and they showed him kind of going to the tree where Savage was killed and laying down some flowers and whatnot. So it was nice. It's not something I really think you have to go out of your way to watch. But if you've got 45 minutes to kill, I could think of worse ways to be spending it. This one didn't really impress me. Hulk Hogan responded to the Savage documentary. He watched it, and he commented on Twitter. And I'm sure he wasn't happy about his ex-wife being interviewed, because there is no love lost between him and Linda. But he said, just watched Vice, The Dark Side of Macho Man, 5 out of 10. Really good, but relied too much on a couple of pictures that somebody had, wink wink, and believed stories that were half-truths and some that were just wrong. What a shame they didn't check all sources. HH. Because without the HH, I wouldn't have believed that tweet was from Hulk Hogan. I would have thought that maybe his ex-wife hacked his Twitter and posted that. So that's what Hogan tweeted. Now, the reason I mentioned this, the best part of this, and he talks about how they should have gone to the source, and okay, right? Well, the Dark Side of the Ring official Twitter account, whoever runs it, responded. They saw Hogan's tweet, and they replied. And this is what they said. Thanks for watching. We reached out to you to participate in this, but you declined. We would have loved to have had your point of view for the story. Hope we can get you on the next one. Oops. So they asked Hogan, of course, why would they not want Hulk Hogan to be part of it? Hulk Hogan was probably the first person they reached out to. And he said no. Now Hogan's going to bitch that they didn't go to the source? Well, he didn't want to participate. He hasn't responded, by the way. So that was, when I saw that tweet, I just started laughing. I'm like, of course. Of course. Complain about how they didn't go to the source, and yet the source doesn't want to cooperate. So what do you expect them to do? Anyway, the next one is on the Montreal Screwjob, which, if I never hear another word about the Screwjob, I would die a happy man. I'm way more interested in seeing the one on Gino Hernandez. I've talked about him a little bit on the podcast over the years. Usually when people send a mailbag question into me about him, I just talked about him a few months ago, actually. One of the great what-if stories in pro wrestling. Had he not died so young when he did, how big could he have gotten? How big of an influential personality in wrestling could he have been? We'll never know.